webinar this evening. Thank you to the Bangor Public Library for hosting. I'm just delighted to be here. We've been giving this talk all year on the anniversary of the 19th Amendment, and running into the close of the year, I'm not sure whether this will be the last time, but it's really been a privilege to talk about the 19th Amendment and the struggle that gave women the right to vote. So we're going to go through my presentation tonight. I'm afraid it's a little long. It's probably about an hour's worth of slides. And if we take questions in the middle, we probably will not get through to the end. So I'm going to ask you to hold your questions until the end, and then I'll do my very best to answer anything that you care to ask. I want to give credit to my colleague in the League, Sheila Kirby, who is not joining us tonight, but who did a ton of work on research and pulling this presentation together. So this year, 2020, marks the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. Women suffragists in the United States had engaged in a sustained, difficult, multi-generational struggle that lasted 72 years between the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 and the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Many of the founders of the movement did not live to see its final accomplishments. To put it in perspective, it was one of the largest civil rights movements in history, period. 20 million people got the right to vote with the passage of that amendment. So we're here tonight to celebrate the courage and the persistence of the women who fought for our right to vote and who eventually succeeded. But we also want to take a clear-eyed look at the divisions and the biases among the movement's leaders, acknowledge some often overlooked deaths, and recognize the toll on those left behind, because not all women and not all people got the right to vote when the 19th Amendment passed. Some were left behind, and many barriers to voting that persisted for years afterwards still persist today. So we want at the same time rededicate ourselves to the work left to be done, not only for women in politics, but also for so many others who face systemic barriers to full political equity and inclusion in civic life. Issues of citizenship, political equity, voting rights had been debated since the founding of the Republic. Those issues were in the room from the very beginning. Race was a big issue in the constitutional conventions and in all the discussions that led to the founding of the Republic. These issues continue to be debated to this day, and those themes continue to resonate in our political discourse. The same issues that resonated through that debate, the founding of our nation, also echoed in the debate for women's suffrage. In 1776, Abigail Adams wrote to her husband, John Adams, asking him to remember the ladies in the founding of the nation. John Adams replied that men will fight the despotism of the petticoat. It sounds a bit jocular, but I don't really think he was kidding. Women's suffrage was a radical idea in the 18th and 19th century. At this time, women held subordinate positions, many duties, and few rights. Some rights enjoyed by women were withdrawn when they married. In fact, many suffragists remained single just on principle for that very reason. Abigail Adams' plea to her husband fell on deaf ears. Some colonial women in the early days were allowed to vote if they paid taxes, if they owned property, if they functioned as an independent head of household, for example, in New York, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New Jersey. The 1787 Constitutional Convention placed voting qualifications in the hands of the states, and voting qualifications in the hands of the states is still an issue that is being settled at the Supreme Court like yesterday. This is still a huge issue. Do the states have the right to set the parameters for who gets to vote? Anyway, women in all the states except New Jersey had, for that reason, lost the right to vote by 1787. And women in New Jersey lost the right to vote in 1807. So By that point, no women were allowed to vote in the US. The early roots of activism were surprisingly among the indigenous people, maybe not so surprising. This particular painting is the trial of Red Jacket, and it's not contemporaneous to the founding of the suffrage movement. It was actually an event that took place in 1869. But Red Jacket was a famous Iroquois chief. He was being tried here on a charge of witchcraft. I included this in the slide deck, though, because the painting shows women participating in the deliberations about whether he was guilty or not. Many of the ideas about individual rights that were adopted by the founders, our founding fathers, had been absorbed and admixed with European Enlightenment by people living in close proximity with Native Americans. What they came up with was an utterly unique formulation of Republican democracy that took into account concepts of individual freedom and responsibility from indigenous people, particularly the Iroquois Confederation, with the principles of the Enlightenment in Europe. Early feminists, too, were inspired by the example of the women of the Iroquois Confederacy. Iroquois women had equal voice politically. Clan mothers nominated chiefs, removing chiefs when necessary. Women participated in all the major decision making. They had the power to veto an act of war. They had property rights. They had voting rights. They had political power. Early suffragists interacting with Native women saw the political power they had and the respect that they received, especially Lucretia Mott and Matilda Gage were among those who observed that firsthand and remarked on the difference between indigenous political rights and rights in their own culture. The other important root of the suffrage movement was in moral outrage over the evils of chattel slavery. This motivated many women to become politically active for the first time. Quakers, church sewing circles, female improvement societies, female anti-slavery societies. Pictured here are the very stern-looking Grimke sisters. Sarah and Angelina Grimke were the daughters of a South Carolina slaveholding family, and they had hated slavery from childhood. They began speaking against slavery to groups of women at first. Later, their audience was joined by more and more men. That was not done. This little cartoon here, a downright gabbler or a goose that deserves to be hissed. They were strongly opposed by the Council of Congregational Ministers of Massachusetts as unwomanly and unchristian because they were speaking to a mixed gender audience. Because these women suffered discrimination in their abolition work, their activism for abolition provided the foundation for the linkage between abolition and women's rights. They started agitating for women's rights as well. Many women abolitionists became active on behalf of greater rights for women this way. The Grimke sisters, Lucy Stone, Lucretia Mott, famous names, Susan Anthony, Sojourner Truth, among many others. Some men, too, like Frederick Douglass, were motivated by this linkage between abolition and women's rights and spoke out for women's rights. The seeds of the suffrage movement, the spark, actually were planted in the summer of 1840. An American delegation, including a number of women, attended the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London. Despite protests, women delegates were not seated among the participants. The women were forced to sit among the spectators where they were not allowed to vote. Among them were Lucretia Mott, a Quaker and part of the Underground Railroad, and the young wife of an abolitionist leader, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Mrs. Stanton's father had been a judge, and from her childhood she heard his often reiterated statement to women, appealing to him for help that they really had no legal redress. These two women became fast friends. With the help of other Quakers, they decided to call a convention in 1848 to discuss the social, civil, and religious rights of women. They published an announcement in the Seneca Courier Gazette setting the date for the following week. Get this, 1 week and inviting the public. And amazingly, 300 people showed up, including 40 men, most notably Frederick Douglass that we talked about before, a former slave and the country's most prominent Black abolitionist. They turned out 300 people on a week's notice without Zoom and, with overland travel. It's quite remarkable. Stanton opened the meeting by reading the Declaration of Sentiments. She adapted the Declaration of Independence to address women's issues. It went, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal," and it went on in that vein. Stanton listed many grievances, including lack of education, employment opportunities, independent political voice for women. Her call for the right to vote, however, was considered radical and was not unanimously approved. Frederick Douglass, who was there and who was a great orator, helped save the resolution. He stood up and spoke very passionately in favor of it. At the end of the 2 days, 68 women and 32 men signed their names to the Declaration of Principles, and a movement was launched. Susan B. Anthony, whose name is linked historically with Mrs. Stanton's, was an incomparable organizer. She joined the movement in 1851 after meeting Mrs. Stanton. Susan Anthony's father had been also a staunch abolitionist. She knew Frederick Douglass and other anti-slavery leaders from before. The working association and friendship between Stanton and Anthony was one of the most fruitful in history. Their talents and their circumstances complemented each other. Mrs. Stanton was tied down with a large family and children, while Miss Anthony remained single, able to travel or to help care for the children to allow Stanton to prepare for speeches or briefs. Behind these two were a host, innumerable other national and local state leaders. Sojourner Truth is one whose name we hear often. She was a freed slave who became an active abolitionist. In 1851, at a women's rights convention in Akron, Ohio, she came forward. The woman speaker, who was on the dais, was being heckled, and the speaker yielded the floor to Sojourner Truth, despite protests from some women. Sojourner Truth made an electrifying speech and turned the tide of the meeting in their favor. It's the famous "Ain't I a Woman" speech. And Sojourner Truth was influential and important to the women's rights movement from then on. Lucy Stone is another. She came from a poor farming family. She worked hard. She saved money. She went to Oberlin. Oberlin was the first college in the U.S. to offer co-ed courses going back to, I think, the 1830s. She lectured on women's rights and on slavery. She married Henry Blackwell, who was, again, a staunch abolitionist and an advocate for women's rights. Together, between the two of them, Henry Blackwell and Lucy Stone Blackwell, and their daughter, Alice Stone Blackwell, they covered nearly the entire span of the women's rights movement from 1847 to 1920. But there were so many. I mean, each of these women and millions of others, so many women, so many stories, too little time. I've shown here Lucretia Mott, Ernestine Rose, Abby Kelly Foster, Paulina Wright Davis, Frances Harper, Charlotte Fortin Grimke. There were so many others. State leaders and Black women who underlined the link between freedom of the slave and equality for women of any color. Too many stories to tell. The other origin for some of the women's rights agitation was in organized labor. Along with abolitionists, this was a key constituency for women's rights. In the first half of the 19th century, women worked in more than 100 industrial occupations, many earning very, very low wages. These women, living in slum conditions, were the first to organize for better pay and shorter hours. Sarah Bagley, the first notable woman trade unionist in the U.S., organized the Lowell Female Labor Reform Association, and they went on strike in the 1830s and 1840s. The movement was just building up momentum. They were lecturing, they were hitting the circuit, they were organizing, and then came the Civil War. And the women's rights movement ground to a halt when the Civil War started, something that neither Mrs. Stanton nor Miss Anthony accepted gracefully. Many abolitionists mistrusted Lincoln. They worked hard to support the Lincoln administration as long as it waged war for freedom, but they didn't entirely believe that he was committed to abolitionism until the Emancipation Proclamation. They worked hard for and collected 400,000 signatures to petition Congress to pass the 13th Amendment, the first of the Reconstruction amendments. And here it is. The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified in 1865 in the aftermath of the Civil War, and it abolished slavery in the United States. The idea that women deserved the same rights as men had been growing steadily in the U.S. this whole time. Many people, including Republicans, mainly Republicans, supported both abolition of slavery and women's rights before the Civil War. But after the Civil War, Republicans felt they had to do all they could to make sure that freed slaves got the right to vote and were able to keep it. Republicans didn't want to muddy the waters with this women's rights issue, and they put women's rights on the back burner. This is only the beginning of a sort of a Sophie's choice, when you can't get it all and you have to get half a loaf instead of none. What do you do? And so in this case, the Republicans went for Black voting rights, put women's rights aside, and women were furious about this and felt entirely betrayed by the party. It was a huge rift. The 14th Amendment defined U.S. citizenship. This was the second of the Reconstruction amendments. The 14th Amendment defined U.S. citizenship for the first time. Section 2, however, introduced the word male into the Constitution for the first time, and it guaranteed voting rights to men only. This was a huge letdown. Women's rights leaders who had put away their cause during the Civil War believed that when peace came, a grateful country would reward them with the right to vote. But the Republican Party was committed to Black voters in the South, and abolitionists believed this was the hour of the Negro. Neither Republicans nor abolitionists had any intention of allowing anything to interfere. And they kind of had a point, because the condition of Black slaves was so abhorrent that that was a superseding goal. Anyway, 6 months later, the 15th Amendment was introduced. This is the one that says the right of citizens to vote shall not be denied. Nothing said about sex. So the men only thing still from before still stands. These three amendments together effectively decoupled citizenship and voting. Every citizen was not guaranteed the right to vote because women were citizens, but they couldn't vote. Stanton and Anthony were indignant, realizing that now a whole new constitutional amendment would be required to give women the vote in federal elections. Other women, Lucy Stone, Julia Ward Howe, disagreed. They favored passage of the amendments, saying that we'd be glad if anybody could get out of the terrible pit of slavery, and just let's get this half a loaf, because we've got to seize this moment to save our Black brethren. So in all fairness, Stanton and others thought that linking the two issues would help, not harm, both issues, that if they stuck together, they could win them both at the same time. But that view did not prevail, and their optimism was unfounded. Some women, led by Stanton and Anthony, actually worked against the Reconstruction amendments, but the 15th Amendment eventually did pass in February of 1870. With this, though, the dreams of universal suffrage were dashed, and the kind of Sophie choice I talked about, which of your children, you can't save them both, you have to choose one. And the echoes of this split between the ending slavery and women's rights is one that would reverberate for generations. It led also to a split in the women's movement. The actual split took place in 1869 when a convention of the Equal Rights Association broke apart on the issue of women's suffrage in the Constitution. Both sides of the split believed that women should have the right to vote, no problem. They clashed sharply on how that goal was to be won. So it fights about tactics now. Mrs. Stanton and Miss Anthony were part of the more radical National Women's Suffrage Association. It was for women only. They now completely distrusted the leadership of men. They believed that other matters of women's rights were also of importance, education, equal pay, and so forth, and that they should get these things by focusing on a federal constitutional amendment. Lucy Stone, Henry Blackwell, Julia Ward Howe, and other more conservative activists, if you want to call it that, formed the American Women's Suffrage Association to work for women's suffrage through amending individual state constitutions, not the federal constitution. They believed that we should avoid linking suffrage with other issues that could alienate more moderate sections of the community, and that they should focus on individual states and women's voting rights only, not all this other stuff. And so the two organizations, proceeded side by side, and they worked bit by bit, state by state, and at the federal level for many years. During this period, they were covering all the bases. I love this particular slide. It's a cigarette advertisement and shows a female baseball player, which, has a little bit of irony to it. But the point is that women were doing everything. They were emerging into new roles. Women were becoming active in many new sectors all over the country. They were taking an active part in political action to bring attention to women's suffrage and other things. They were organizing state suffrage associations, informing public opinion. They were conducting campaigns, referendum campaigns in several states. They maintained pressure on Congress for a federal amendment to the Constitution, and they were engaging in acts of civil disobedience. Women tried to vote in 1871 and 1872 against the law, and a couple of these things went to court. Like reformers today, they were not ignoring the opportunity for judicial relief. The most famous of the court cases was that of Susan Anthony, who, on the left here, led a group of 16 women in Rochester, New York, to register and vote in the presidential election of 1872. Prosecutors in the Grant administration were anxious that the case not go to the Supreme Court, and a compliant judge made it so by denying her grounds for appeal. I think she'd been bailed out, and this recently became controversial again when President Trump actually pardoned her. Maybe not a pardon she would have wished to have. During 1872 presidential election, Virginia Minor also tried to register to vote and was refused in St. Louis. The Minors sued in court, St. Louis Circuit Court. The Minor case did go to the Supreme Court, which then handed down a decision in 1874 that suffrage was not coextensive with citizenship, that the states were within their rights to withhold suffrage from women, even if they were citizens of the United States. And here we are. The measure later called the Anthony Amendment, and what's up here is the original amendment that first was introduced in 1878. The exact same wording was the one that finally passed in 1920. This amendment was originally brought forward in 1878. It was at that time to be the 16th Amendment. It failed to pass, and it subsequently lost ground. Numbers 16, 17, and 18 were taken up by other things. 16 became the income tax. 17 was the direct election of senators. The 18th was famously prohibition. The 1878 Anthony Amendment passed more than 40 years later without a single change in wording. But in 1878, when it first came in, it was roundly defeated, led entirely by the southern states. Meanwhile, efforts to pick off state by state, territory by territory actually did make some grounds. The territory of Wyoming passed the first women's suffrage bill in 1869. It gave women the vote, it gave them control over their own property, and it protected them against wage discrimination as teachers. Lawmakers wanted to get Wyoming some good publicity because it was like 9-to-1 men not that many women. And they were thinking if they passed these women's rights measures, maybe more women would come to Wyoming. Democrats in the legislature also wanted to embarrass the Republican governor. They thought if the legislature passed this, the Republican governor would have to veto it, but he surprised them and passed it. The measure also had a little bit of a racial bias undertone. Many who supported it believed strongly that if Blacks and Chinese were to have the vote, then women, especially white women, should have the vote too. But as I said, people may have been a little surprised when it passed. The governor signed it into law, and as many as 1,000 women appeared to have gone to the polls the following year and voted, to the disgust of the Democrats who had led the passage of this measure. Many of those women voted for Republicans. But it was slow going state by state. In the 1890s, the rise of the populist movement provided some context for a couple of successful state referenda, first in Colorado and then in Idaho in 1896. But it was 2 steps forward, a half a step back. In Utah, women's suffrage got tangled up in the polygamy controversy. Women got the right to vote, but then in 1887, Congress punitively disenfranchised everybody in Utah until the Mormons repudiated polygamy, and it was a long time before women got it back. In 1883, the Washington Territorial Legislature passed a women's suffrage bill with bipartisan support, but the liquor lobby got it overturned. As I sometimes say, it's only a law. What you can pass, you can repeal. And that was what happened here. And we'll talk a little bit more about the liquor lobby in a minute. Finally, they did get a new referendum in 1910 to finally succeed and get Washington the right to vote for women. But it was a long, dry spell, and it was super slow going. Finally, a big breakthrough in California, the biggest campaign yet, was mounted by a suffrage organization in 1911. Support flowed into California from all over the country. Campaign workers stayed out of the big cities because they believed the liquor lobby would buy the San Francisco and Oakland vote. So they were focusing on the little towns and villages, out of town. Liquor interests believed women would pass prohibition. That's why the liquor interests didn't want women to have the right to vote. And, there was sort of something to that. Anyway, the morning after the referendum election in California, when only the urban vote had been counted, the papers carried the news that the measure had been defeated. But over the course of the next several days, the rural vote was still coming in. And finally, when all the votes were tallied, the referendum won in California by 3,500 votes. And suddenly, women had the vote in 6 states with a total of 37 electoral votes for the presidency. They were becoming a political force to be reckoned with. And it's probably worth pausing on that note to say about votes trickling in, like we have an echo of that history unfolding before us right now, with late votes trickling in and having an impact on the final outcome. Anyway, California passed and other states soon followed. By 1914, we have this map here. The yellow states show where women had the right to vote in all elections. There's quite a few. The black ones are where women had no rights to vote at all, including Maine, alas. The stripy states, women had partial suffrage. Maybe they could vote in school board or municipal elections. Illinois had some weirdo hybrid where municipal and partial state and county, but not presidential. Anyway, this was the map. And women voting in federal elections were numerous enough now that they were beginning to have an effect on Senate and congressional races. And success in the states would soon begin to exert pressure at the federal level as these congressional delegates became more favorable to women's rights issues. In about this time, Alice Stone Blackwell, remember the daughter of Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell, finally helped heal the breach between the American and the National Associations for Women's Suffrage, and a joint convention was held in 1890, forming the National American Women's Suffrage Association. During these years, activists gain confidence and political skills. They mobilized resources, they raised money, they learned how to maneuver through the political process, and they built a massive social movement, millions of volunteers reaching into every single state, as I mentioned before. This was one of the largest civil rights movements in history. Now, before we, get to the finish line here, I want to just take a look at the diversity of the women that were working on this issue. Sorry about that. Let me shut that little puppy off. Society was changing. The expansion of women's opportunities for higher education provided a catalyst for suffrage activism on many fronts. Public agricultural and technical colleges, the land grant universities, number of private colleges with Vassar, Oberlin admitting women. After graduation, many of these women found themselves largely excluded from the professions for which they trained, and they channeled their skills and energy into civic engagement and social reform. But when they figured out they couldn't actually get anything done if they didn't have the vote, many of them turned to reform politics. We talked a little bit about the temperance movement. Here you can see lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. This was an important constituency in the suffrage movement. Many women became interested in suffrage through their membership in other organizations, but the Women's Christian Temperance Union was an exemplar. Women's rights reformers had long been concerned with the temperance question because married women were completely at the mercy of their husbands. And if their husbands were drunk, these could lead to cruel and abusive situations. In 1874, the Women's Christian Temperance Union reached into every state in the nation and represented 200,000 women. It was an early supporter of voting rights, especially as related to regulating alcohol. I mean, they did intend to pass prohibition. Many suffrage leaders felt that the two issues, temperance and suffrage, should not be linked in the public mind because the liquor interests were a powerful anti-suffrage opponent. And they were becoming stronger and more vitriolic, and they were showing up in all of these referendum campaigns and in legislatures trying to get women's suffrage measures defeated and overturned. People blamed the Women Christian Temperance Unit for losses in these states, and there was something to that. The National Federation of Colored Women was another one. It was formed in 1896. It was an early and important endorser of women's suffrage. Many, many very skillful Black activists. Voting rights were important to Black women, maybe more so than for white women. But even though the civil rights for Blacks and women had been linked since the early days of the abolition movement, Black women were not accorded full equity in the suffrage movement. Their chapters were separate. They weren't asked to affiliate with national federations. They had to form their own federation. It was totally segregated. When the general, you have to contrast the pictures of these women and their different class and circumstances. But when the General Federation of Women's Clubs was established in 1890, it represented 200 groups and 20,000 women. By the time they endorsed suffrage in 1914, it was huge. They had 2 million members. Similarly, they were mostly interested in community issues, but when they were trying to deal with poverty, public health, temperance, and child welfare, they found political power was super important. So again, when they finally did come around, they were very slow to endorse suffrage because these were community-based interests that embraced many women from many, many different political spectrums, and it was hard for them to reach consensus. But finally, in 1914, they came across and they brought their 2 million members with them. From the beginning of the women's rights movement, women who worked didn't have time for political activism. But finally, in the early part of the 20th century, this was beginning to change. Women who worked to support themselves and their families found a way for political activism too. And you see here in this slide, Women's Suffrage Party garden plot. This is farm women for suffrage, super important. And working and union women Women joined labor unions, they held strikes for higher pay, they protested for better working conditions, and in some ways were very politically savvy. Working women started seeing the vote as a way to gain more political power for their economic equity issues. Harriet Stanton Blatch, the daughter of suffrage leader Elizabeth Cady Stanton, was among the first suffragists to recruit working women to support suffrage. Blatch wanted to integrate the more aggressive and militant tactics of labor activists, parades through city streets, speakers on street corners, rabble rousing, publicity stunts. She wanted to integrate those tactics into the suffrage strategies to attract more publicity. Working women and their experience with these tactics eventually proved vital to winning the vote. Middle class and moral judgments often alienated their intended beneficiaries. These women were not marching at the front of the parade, but their efforts did begin to establish ties with working class constituencies, and labor organizations would eventually gain a lot of support for the suffrage movement. So these things all started to come together around 1912. Women's suffrage was supported for the first time at a national party level by Theodore Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party. Interest in the federal amendment was, however, at an all-time low. There was a lot of action in the states, nothing happening in the U.S. Congress. Alice Paul arrived at the National American Women's Suffrage Association to shake things up. She was a brilliant organizer, an inspiring leader. She attracted a cadre of radical and committed young activists frustrated by the conservatism of the more traditional organizational leadership. They borrowed strategies from the radical Women's Social and Political Union in England and from labor organizations in the US. Within 2 months of her arrival in Washington at the Nassau National American Women's Suffrage Association headquarters, they had organized a massive suffrage parade. It was to be held on March 3rd, the day before Woodrow Wilson's presidential inauguration. The parade, calling for a federal constitutional amendment, featured 8,000 marchers, 9 marching bands, 4 mounted brigades, 20 floats, and an allegorical performance near the Treasury Building. The parade began late, but it got off to a pretty good start until the route along Pennsylvania Avenue became choked with tens of thousands of male spectators in town for the inauguration. The marchers were jostled, ridiculed by many in the crowd. Some were tripped, others were assaulted. Policemen appeared to be either indifferent to the struggling paraders or sympathetic to the mob. I mean, we hear echoes of this even today. Before the day was out, 100 marchers had been hospitalized. The mistreatment of the marchers amplified the event and the cause into a major news story and led to congressional hearings where the DC superintendent of police lost his job. I don't think Alice Paul really wanted anybody to get hurt, but she couldn't have been more pleased with the publicity that this generated for her cause. Paul wanted suffragists to be more provocative, hoping for a publicity-rich strategy that would help secure the passage of a federal suffrage amendment. Then traditional leadership of the National American Women's Suffrage Association preferred the state-by-state campaigns and traditional methods, petitioning, legislators, lobbying, politicians, sort of a front door strategy. Soon after the 1913 parade, militant suffragists broke away from the National American Women's Suffrage Association and founded what would become the National Women's Party. Its sole purpose was to work on a federal suffrage amendment, and the split between them deepened when the upstart organization began campaigning and endorsing candidates, which the National American Women's Suffrage would never do, never endorse candidates, completely nonpartisan. So, but the new women's suffrage, the new I lost my place here. Sorry, getting back. The new National Women's Party endorsed candidates, and they worked to elect candidates that would support their view. They opposed Democrats. They supported Republicans. Remember, at this time, it was the Republicans who were more likely to be pro-suffrage. Nassau didn't like it. They didn't like it at all, but it kind of worked. Half of the candidates that had been opposed by the National Women's Party lost. And soon thereafter, women's suffrage was reintroduced in Congress for the first time in 2 decades. Of course, that strategy wouldn't have worked if the state-by-state strategy had not already gained a foothold in the West. But this infuriated the leadership in Nassau since it undermined efforts to lobby politicians to gain their support. It made them look more partisan than they really wanted to be. Nassau moved in a diametrically opposite direction, in evolving a strategy to win over President Wilson to their side, and he did gradually change his mind and addressed their convention in 1916. Carrie Chapman Catt, who was the founder of the League of Women Voters, was the leader of the National American Women's Suffrage Association at this time, and she was sort of a foil to Alice Paul. She was a brilliant organizer. She was an engineer in an organizing sense. She drew up detailed plans on how to accomplish the goal of picking away and getting a federal amendment passed, outlining a new approach, each state with a role to play. At the same time, efforts to win state campaigns continued because of Mrs. Catt's leadership. In 1915, the referendum was coming up again in the state of New York, and there was an enormous effort to collect signatures, more than 1 million women in New York. The most significant development that year, 1915, was the decision of the powerful Democratic machine, Tammany Hall, to abstain from opposing the suffrage measure for the first time. I guess they felt it was too dangerous to alienate the oncoming women voters, that this was a tide that would not be turned. In any case, Tammany Hall sat it out. This proved conclusive, and the measure passed with a margin of more than 100,000 votes in New York City. The rest of the state broke even. The more states, and the more big states, that allowed women to vote in federal elections, the more susceptible Congress became to the pressure of women's votes. We're getting pretty close to the finish line here, but before I go that way, I wanted to say a word about the opposition. Urban working class men were understandably reluctant to grant more power to middle class women, who condemned them as dirty, drunken immigrants and violent radicals. So there was politics of resentment there. Their opposition defeated many state campaigns. Finally, the inclusion of some working class suffragists began to characterize the vote as a way to protect wage earners and empower working class as a whole. And that did eventually make some inroads. We talked about opposition from liquor interests. That was very real. Other political machines like Tammany Hall were in the opposition. And there was a lot of anti-suffrage activity among the Catholic clergy, and very conservative views at the church. However, the original and the most powerful anti-leaders were women of wealth and standing. The National Association opposed to women's suffrage. These were women who were doing pretty well under the existing system. They were the anti-suffrage leaders in the North. They were urban, daughters and wives of well-to-do businessmen, bankers, or politicians. In the South, the anti-suffrage leaders were generally from the planter class, and their resistance was tied to worries about disruption of the racial order. Also big business. This is a slide I took from some of my money and politics work, but you can see the Steel Beam Trust, the Copper Trust, Standard Oil Trust, these are the barons of industry. Business interests were difficult to link directly with anti-suffrage activity. However, suffragists on the ground reported the presence of railroad, oil, and general manufacturing lobbies when suffrage was up for legislative action or for referendum. Some of the women anti-leaders that we talked about on the last slide were the wives, daughters of these exact same industry barons. They bitterly opposed the federal income tax authorized by the 16th Amendment because they believed it was communistic, and they opposed the popular election of U.S. senators. You know, they just felt like having a large body of voters was generally a menace, you know, turning over the future of the country to the rabble and unwashed. One of the women who knew the senators well wrote that they believed in an oligarchy of the well-to-do, and that they were worried about further regulation if women were allowed to vote. In fact, they were kind of right. Some industry leaders were worried that women would use the power of the vote to improve the conditions of working women, to regulate industry, to end child labor. And in fact, when they got the vote, that's kind of exactly what they did. And then the last opposition was in the South. Southern Democrats were the staunchest foes of the 19th Amendment, viewing it as a threat to civilization. No hyperbole. Even after Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, reversed his opposition in 1918, he was unable to bring his party along. It had taken every bit of racist ingenuity to erect the Jim Crow barriers that defanged the 14th and 15th Amendments. By 1918, poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses had closed Southern voting booths to African American men. Women's suffrage would undermine that bigoted project if it spurred interracial solidarity among women and led to enforcement of constitutional rights for Blacks. The National American Women's Suffrage Association was a compromiser, and the Shafroth-Palmer Amendment defined women's suffrage, this came up in 1914, defined women's suffrage as a states' rights issue. Does that have a familiar ring to it? States' rights, voting, states' rights. Nassau, believing that the federal amendment could never be ratified without the support of some of the southern states, supported the Shafroth-Palmer Amendment. This is another of those half a loaf, Sophie's Choice type things. If you think you can't get it all, you have to sometimes take what you can get. Anyway, the National Women's Party, their sister organization, opposed Shafroth-Palmer. You know, who knows where the right was. 10 states ultimately refused to ratify the 19th Amendment after it passed, and they were all in the South: Delaware, Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Florida. All right, the final push. When the United States entered the war in April 1917, neither Nassau nor the National Women's Party abandoned the suffrage struggle as they had during the Civil War. In spite of earlier pacifism by Carrie Chapman Catt and others, Nassau urged women to continue to engage in both war work and suffrage agitation, hoping that the patriotic efforts of these women would gain additional public support for the suffrage cause. The National Women's Party, concentrating exclusively on suffrage, continued using militant tactics and introduced propaganda ridiculing claims that America could fight for democracy abroad while denying women the right to vote at home. Most infamously, in January 1917, the National Women's Party began silent picketing outside the White House. If some of you have seen the movie Iron Jawed Angels, you'd be familiar with this chapter. Initially tolerated by the Wilson administration, harassment and violence by onlookers escalated, and in June, the picketers were arrested. Ultimately, 218 women were arrested. At first, the charges were dismissed and the sentences were minimal, but penalties increased over time. Some of the women began hunger strikes to protest their punishment, the bad conditions, and the brutal treatment in prison. In response, authorities subjected them to force feeding, as you see in this picture. Faced with terrible publicity once word got out, officials finally released all the picketers in late November. But women were coming forth in increasing numbers to do jobs previously held by men and to sit on government bodies associated with the war effort. The last parade in New York, suffrage parade in New York in 1917, had divisions of women farmers, women workers in industry, doctors, Red Cross nurses, emphasizing the role as equal partners in the economy and in the war effort. Hopes for a quick victory in World War I were shattered. It wasn't going to happen. Wilson, preoccupied with the war, and it was not moving on women's suffrage. So an impatient National Women's Party resumed their militant demonstrations, generating more arrests, more jail sentences, more publicity. It took over a year and a half for the Senate to vote on the suffrage amendment, and only at the instigation, they only brought it up for a vote because a hostile senator was confident that it would lose. But on September 30th that year, Wilson took the unusual step of addressing the Senate during the debate, describing enfranchisement as only fair, considering all the contributions women had made to the war effort. However, states' rights advocates in the South remained adamantly opposed, and it lost by 2 votes. Meanwhile, in an eerie echo of the past in the current moment, just a few days after that vote, the flu hit. Carrie Chapman Catt herself got sick. So did the Speaker of the House and the House Majority Leader. Public gatherings were banned. Referendum campaigns in several states were curtailed. Campaigns shifted from in-person rallies to phone banking, letter writing, and newspaper ads. Women across the country were volunteering as nurses. Between that and their contributions to the war effort, women gained a lot of sympathy as being very patriotic. In the November elections, the Democrats lost control of the Senate, and with several new pro-suffrage lawmakers voted in on the Republican ticket. Referendums in Michigan, South Dakota, and Oklahoma passed too, so additional suffrage states were coming into Congress. In February 1919, the Senate had defeated the amendment again by 1 vote, but 6 months later, more state legislatures had granted women the right to vote, and by the time Wilson called Congress into special session in May, the vote passed in the House by a wide majority, thanks to the election of over 100 new pro-suffrage legislators in the states. It passed in the Senate on June 4th by a 2-vote majority. Ratification of the amendment required another long struggle. It came quickly in states where suffrage organizations were active, but the progress dragged on into 1920. Finally, only 1 more state was needed, but all of the holdouts were in the South. The battle came to a head in August in Tennessee, with relentless lobbying by pro and anti-suffrage forces, hijinks, dirty tricks, threats, bribes, drunken legislators. The state Senate passed the measure easily, but in the House, there were numerous delays engineered by the opposition, and suffrage leaders believed that they were going to lose, that they lacked the votes for passage. On August 18th, 1920, the vote finally came. When the roll call reached young Harry Byrne, a young Republican from the eastern mountains of Tennessee, he unexpectedly voted aye, later explaining that his mother had written him to support the measure. Feb Byrne, that was her name, Feb Byrne wrote to her son Harry, "Hoorah, and vote for suffrage. Don't keep them in doubt. Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Thomas Catt. With lots of love, Mama." Harry Byrne is sainted in the suffrage movement for that very moment. The 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution squeaked to victory. When news reached the big cities, women flooded into the streets, euphoric. Over 500 separate campaigns, millions of volunteers, 70 years of struggle, 20 million new voters. The League of Women Voters was founded by Carrie Chapman Catt that year as a way of helping women carry out a mighty political experiment and bringing those 20 million new voters into their full responsibilities as citizens and voters. It encouraged them to use their new power to participate in shaping public policy. From the beginning, the League was an activist grassroots organization whose leaders believed that citizens should play a critical role in advocacy. When you look at this plank, this is the I don't know if you can see this slide, but this is the plank that they advertised to the National League of Women Voters when they addressed the Democratic Party. The planks that they wanted in their platform were child welfare, education, home and high prices, women in gainful occupation, and public health and morale. All of the reforms that big industry had feared were exactly the ones that they went after first. An interesting local note, Maud Wood Park, standing on the right with the little fur hat on, she was the first president of the National League of Women Voters, and she had a connection to Maine, retiring to Cape Elizabeth in the 1920s and living there for a while. All right, so let's just recap some of the splits and divisions. And at this sort of Black Lives Matter moment, we have to talk about racism. Roots in the anti-slavery movement did not mean that white suffragists believed in racial equity. The rift began with the passage of the 15th Amendment, but that wasn't all. Mrs. Stanton made derogatory references to Sambo and the enfranchisement of ignorant foreigners. She talked about how white women would be degraded if Black men got the vote first. There's no way for us to hear those words now and not hear them as racist. When she, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Matilda Gage, and Ida Harper wrote the history of women's suffrage, the significance of Black women in the movement was completely undocumented, overlooked. And because this was the seminal history, it's often overlooked even today. They were so many stories, so many important women to the movement. I've pictured a few of them here. Mary Church Terrell, Mary Ann Shadd Cary, Coralie Franklin Cook, Mary Stewart, Harriet Fortin Purvis, Sarah Parker Redmond, Charlotte Fortin Grimke, Frances Harper. You know, these are names that you don't hear in the Pantheon all the time, but they were equally important to the success of the movement overall. And Blacks were excluded. The National Women's Suffrage Association was the dominant white suffrage organization. It held conventions that excluded Black women. The exclusion of Black women from most of the white clubs led them to organize their own clubs and to recognize the need for their own national organization. But in the 20th century, the National American Women's Suffrage Association discouraged Black women clubs from trying to affiliate with their national federation. Alice Paul refused to let the celebrated newspaper editor Ida Wells march with the white delegation in the 1913 parade. Stung and in tears, Wells slipped into the Illinois delegation anyway and marched with them, but the stings, well, what am I trying to say? It stung. And they were sold out. You know, many compromises were made to the states' rights contingent. By the 1910s, many white suffragists had come to believe that focusing on white women voting was the only way they were going to get the 19th Amendment through Congress. Carrie Chapman Catt openly acknowledged that Black women in the South would likely be disenfranchised in precisely the same way that Black men had been. She further noted that in Southern states, on the whole, white women outnumbered Black women. So, this is a quote, "If the South really wants white supremacy, it will urge the enfranchisement of women because it'll be more white women." These statements are outrageous to modern ears, but the backers of women's suffrage counted votes. And here's that old Sophie's Choice again, they didn't have the votes. In fact, when it happened, the passage of the 19th Amendment led to a doubling down on Jim Crow, made it worse for African Americans, and white women were no help. Support for literacy tests survived for decades out of fears that undereducated working people and immigrants would vote. Redress on some of these matters would have to wait 45 years, and the struggles of those issues continue to this day. And the clash of the titans. We see Carrie Chapman Catt on the left and Alice Paul on the right, two very powerful women, strong personalities, very, very talented. These arguments about should we be in the street or should we be under the dome? Should we be going in through the front door or should we be creating civil disobedience? Should we be radical or should we be polite? Should we have state campaigns or a federal campaign? Should we endorse candidates or should we remain nonpartisan? These arguments are still very vibrant in our political culture today. In the end, it turned out for the suffrage movement that it took both. But the strategy was almost as bitterly contested in the moment as the policy itself. After the passage of the 19th Amendment, there remained divisions about support for the ERA. This was Alice Paul's next project. In 1923, she introduced what was actually the exact same wording of the ERA that finally came forward in the 1970s. But anyway, many women, including the League of Women Voters, believed that important labor protections that had been hard won for working women. See, they couldn't get it for all workers. They couldn't get it for men and women. They could only get it for women. So they'd gotten labor protections for women, and they were afraid if the Equal Rights Amendment passed that those labor protections would be lost and women would be reduced to the same condition as men. For these reasons and others, the League did not endorse the ERA until 1972. So who got left behind? He's sometimes said that half of America got the vote. That wasn't quite what happened. A lot of women, 20 million women is nothing to sneeze at, but a lot of people got left behind. African Americans, Mexican Americans, Franco Americans, Asian Americans, you get the idea. Over the intervening century, many barriers have come down. In 1965, with the passage of the Voting Rights Act, poll taxes, literacy tests were made illegal, so voters of color were granted broad voting rights. Of course, in 1913, some of those protections were in 1913. In 2013, just a couple of years ago, some of those protections were stripped away. It took until 1943 with the Chinese Exclusion Act, in 1952 with the McCarran-Walters Act, that all Asians, including Asian women, were granted the right to naturalize and vote. Native people won citizenship in 1924, but the struggle for voting rights stretched on much longer. Natives weren't guaranteed the right to vote in every state until 1962. Here in Maine, literacy tests persisted into the latter half of the 20th century, well into the 1970s, targeting primarily Franco-American voters. Prisoner and felon disenfranchisement was explicitly permitted by the 13th Amendment. Under Jim Crow, Blacks were convicted in order to permanently disenfranchise them. That barrier is only now beginning to fall, but not without a fight. Florida passed that thing granting ex-felons the right to vote, and they just cannot seem to get it implemented. Many other barriers remain. This is a picture of Lucy Nicholar Pula, who casting her ballot in 1955. She was the first Penobscot woman, the first Penobscot person to vote in Maine, 1955. And the conversation about where racial tensions and racial equity fits into American civic life could not be more front and center than it is right now. At the same time, women didn't get everything they wanted either. In terms of leadership, studies done by organizational psychologists show that when asked to draw a picture of an effective leader, both men and women almost always draw a man. And these unconscious assumptions about gender affect people's ability to recognize emerging leadership if it comes in the wrong package. Getting noticed as a leader in the workplace and in politics is more difficult for women than it is for men. That's just the way it is. And there are still significant voting restrictions in many states. Overall, 25 5 states have put in place new restrictions since 2010, and some of those are multiplying in the course of the hotly contested presidential election this year. More restrictive voter ID laws, photo ID, making it harder for citizens to register, cutting back early voting opportunities, harder to restore voting rights for people with criminal convictions. And I mentioned previously the rollback on the Voting Rights Act in 2013. Still, we have made strides. Women have been elected to state legislatures and to Congress and have held high administrative posts. And we'll see what happens next week. As of 2018, 3 women, Geraldine Ferraro, Sarah Palin, and now Kamala Harris, have won the vice presidential nominations for their major parties. 1 woman actually secured the presidential nomination for a major party. We have the first female Speaker of the House. We have the first state legislature that's majority women. That's Nevada as of 2018. In Colorado, their House, not both chambers, but the House is majority women. We had a record 127 women serving in the 2 houses of Congress. I mean, that's not half, but it's more than it ever was before. We still are underrepresented in Congress and across the political spectrum, and we still have not elected a woman president, but we have made some progress. There's still plenty to do. The debate continues over how intersectional feminism should be, that is Black rights and women's rights. Building trust among each other is really hard after all the water that's gone over the dam. Fighting for political equity universally applied may be a never-ending struggle, never fully won. They say the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice, but don't you believe it? It must be bent. And it will take all of our strength to do it. Is anybody left?
Yep, we have everybody.
Unmute. If anybody wants to ask questions, this would be the moment.
Fran, did you want to ask a question, or do you want me to do it?
Sure, I'll ask. I was curious, when did Maine ratify that amendment, the 19th Amendment?
That is a good question, and I knew that at one point, but I don't know it today.
Someone said they haven't, and I wondered if that's true.
I don't think it is.
I think it was
Linda, yeah.
Yeah, 1919, sometime November, 1st of November.
That makes sense to me too. That rings a bell with me.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure about the ERA. Linda, do you know about that? Has Maine ratified the ERA?
Don't know.
Okay. Other questions?
There isn't anything on Facebook. Lots of thank yous, and it was so interesting. Oh, November 5th, 1919. That just popped right up.
There
on
you go.
Facebook chat.
Crowdsource it.
Yep.
All right, thank you.
It was amazing. Thank you. Those were our Facebook comments.
At the beginning of the year, I went to see the exhibit in the Augusta State Museum about women's suffrage.
Mm-hmm.
It was wonderful. Of course, then the pandemic came.
I know. I mean,
But
isn't it
hopefully-
just a spooky echo that we're having a pandemic now and we had a pandemic then? It's just like weird.
Kind of a double pandemic then, because you don't hear about the tuberculosis that was happening at the same time. So,
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, strange. But
Well, thank you all for tuning in and for hanging with me. I know it was a long presentation. There's a lot of material to cover, but I really appreciate your attention through to the end. And thank you for joining.